Okay, so I'm back at Forward Forward, and what I'm going to talk about is some blunders which Hinton made, and I what why I believe like the Forward Forward algorithm is facing like a lot of problems to work in practice. Okay, and again these are like my intuitions, and I'm not sure whether they are correct or not, but hopefully like the time will tell us the answer. Okay, so let's look at like some assumptions which Hinton made in the Forward Forward algorithm. So the first problem in Hinton's forward forward is basically that if you look at the image which he is using as a positive data and a negative data, so the top left border is what he uses to inject the class information in. So in case like your image is like let's say 100 by 100, and if the image can belong to any of the possible 1000 classes, it is like impossible to have information of the classes injected into the pixels, right? Because the width of this is only 100 and the classes is like 1000, so you will need at least 10 rows to inject like the class specific information, and it is like somehow very weird, and it looks like a bit of patchwork which I am not happy about. Now the second point he is making assumption is that the network is intelligent enough. So there are like certain pixels here which belong to the classes, and there are certain pixels which belong to the images. So I am not sure, I am not happy with the way what he is doing is that it is not clear like how does a network distinguish between a pixel which corresponds to a class and a pixel which corresponds to an image. And since it's not clear, this is something what I call as a symmetry problem, because it is not clear which of the pixels in the image belongs to the class and which of the image belongs to the actual information of the image. Okay, so that is like the other problem. The third problem is that his network won't scale up with the number of classes. So what he's doing is that he's relying on a fixed number of classes. So he's assuming like he's assuming that he knows beforehand that the given input can belong to maybe 10 classes or 1000 classes. But what if there are the given input can belong to any possible class in the future? And that is like the same problem with softmax, because in softmax you need to predefine the number of neurons which you know beforehand, and that actually, so if you have any class which comes during testing which is not part of the softmax, then it's impossible to classify the new sample without actually pre-training the softmax layer again. And that is like a problem which was solved later with contrastive learning, and but still it is a problem in the way like Hinton is doing forward in his paper. Okay, now let's talk about another thing. Like the key point is that he says so all the experiments in his paper which he did were only done with MNIST. Now there was this smart guy Raymond Y. Kajal, and he used to be a big hotshot biologist, and he said that it is more. Hinton says that it's more informative to report the performance on non-existent net than to report performance on any particular net. So he says that I will just report performance on MLP and not on CNN. But the key point is that if you have to make it work in real world, you have to show a performance how how forward will stack against CNN and ResNets and maybe some sort of transformers. So he got away with this because he was focusing on making a learning algorithm which actually works and ironing out the kinks. So most of the people in the community will say that this is like really bad because he didn't show it for all the other possible networks. But I would say it is good because he simplified the problem to this much that okay, give me a full layer network, and then I would be happy enough to like just train it and try to understand whether how does it perform as compared to backpropagation. So the key learning for this is that it is possible to build new algorithms still using MNIST and using very small number of nets like just 2 or 3 layer MLP and see what is happening. And that is the best way to do the experiments, because in that way like you can train thousands of neural networks and have a very quick iteration span, as compared to this fucking deep learning in which you have to train it forever to get the results, and then your lifespan is gonna pass and the research will not get anywhere. Okay, so that is one of the key points here. And now what I will do is I will actually go through the forward paper and try to understand some philosophical points which he has talked about. So the point is that most of the videos of forward just go are just the part one I made, and they skip over the philosophical part which Hinton actually talks about. Okay, sorry, I'm back. Okay, so let's look over some of the philosophical stuff which Hinton wrote. And this is something which he says is about modeling the top down effects in perception. And what does like the top down effect mean? So what he means by top down what he means by top down connection is that in the brain, let's say you have these five layers, layer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and all the neural networks are forward basing. So layer input goes from layer 1 to layer 2, layer 2 to layer 3 to layer 4, and layer 4 to layer 5. But then what happens is that these type of networks are known as feed forward networks. But there is another in the if you look at the brain, actually what happens is that there are a lot of connections which are coming back from the top layer to the bottom layer. And the point is that it is not possible to train these networks because it forms a cycle in the computation graph. And somehow the representations at the top layer are actually informing the representation which you learn at the lower layer. And that is forming like a sort of this loop, sort of this feedback loop, which is actually helping improve the learning process. And that is what Hinton says is actually the backpropagation objective. So that's what he says is like the key point in like top-down effects, which like backpropagation, which you can't do in backpropagation because you have this computational circular graph, and it is very difficult to get rid of to actually calculate the gradients in this way if you're gonna learn, because the graph contains cycle. But in this case what he does is that he says that this is so there is a problem with backpropagation in that the later layers cannot affect what is learned in the earlier layers. So you can't have, since you can't have like these connections anymore, since you can't have these connections in backpropagation, so the later layer, which is layer 5, can't affect what is happening in layer 1, and that is like the key problem which is happening. But he says that this is not a problem in forward. Okay, so what he does is that uh, he is trying to show that this is not a problem in forward, and the earlier layer, later layer can still affect the earlier layer in a forward type of algorithm in the following way. So let's say what happens is that you have this image of a 6, and you have a network which just consists of two layers. Okay, so you have a network which is layer 1 and layer 2, and what you're gonna do is that you are gonna copy this 6 3 times. And this is what he says is a recurrent network used to process a video. So in your case, like if you're trying to process this 6, you're repeating this 6 for 3 time steps, and it becomes like a sort of video for the network. And what happens is that one for t equal to 1, for t equal to 1, t equal to 2, and t equal to 3. So for t equal to 1, what you're gonna do is that you're gonna pass your 6 here, and you will get like some activity here in this layer, and then you will have like some activity in this layer, and then you will have some activity here. Okay, so now what will happen is that when you're doing like the second forward pass, at that time what will happen is that the activities of the earlier layer, so like the activities of layer 2 which you stored earlier, can be actually used to influence what is happening in this layer. So you are like storing the activities. So for t equal to 1, you stored like the activations at this location and this location. And then let's say you are at t equal to 2, then what you are doing is basically somehow when you are updating this particular weights again, you are using the information from this higher level representation at a previous time step in order to like update this particular neuron. Okay, so let me put it like more formally and a bit more cleanly so that it is clear to all of you. So what he's saying is that if you so this is like the same neural network which is repeated for 3 time steps. So these weights w1 is shared across time, and this w2 is shared across time, And when you are looking like at a particular time step, so if you want to update this representation, you can actually use you can update this representation by using the representation of a higher layer at a previous time step and its old representation also. Okay, so that's the point, that you have a higher layer representation which you calculated in a previous time step, and that can be directly used to influence the representation in a later time step of this particular neuron. And that is what he says is like used to model the top down effect of perception, because you can just store this. So for t equal to 1, you can just store these activations in memory, m1 m2, and then when you're computing this m3, you can actually update m3 as a function of m3, m1, and m2. Okay, so here m1 and m2 are actually computed. Here m1 and m2, like here m1, so m3 is updated as a function of m3, m1, m2, and m3 is computed at time step t, and m1 and m2 are computed at time step t minus 1. And what you can do is you can store, like, there is one problem with this scenario. The problem is this: while you're doing updating m3, you still need to store m1 and m2 from the previous time step in memory. Okay, so you still need to store the representation m1 and m2 in memory from the previous time step, and this is gonna consume additional memory. And this is not clear in the brain how it is happening, because definitely, like, we are not storing these activation patterns in the memory. We are not storing these activation patterns, these activations, like in a separate memory bank in the brain, because the size of the brain is constant. And that is like what is happening here. So you, since you are like storing the activations, you are occupying this double the memory, and that's like not correct, because the only memory which you are allowed to consume is basically the memory which you are in the current time step. Okay, so this is like a fundamental problem here. And now I also want to talk about like another problem in the neural networks which is happening. And you need to understand why it's a big deal. So let's say that you have these three neurons connected to these two neurons. Okay. Okay. Now 3 into 2. So there are 6 weights here in this network. So the only memory which you want to occupy in the neural network is corresponding to these 6 weights. So whatever computation you do, like whatever input you see, you are never allowed to occupy memory which is more than these 6 weights. And that is something which all the neural networks of the world are violating right now. Why? Because if you see, like, they teach in the normal school that the forward pass of a neural network is w times x. So here let's say your y is equal to w times x. So here let's say your x is a matrix which contains like d cross n, d dimensions, and it's a n, it's a sequence of n tokens with d dimensions each, and your weight matrix is d by d. So once you multiply this, your output will actually cancel out, and your y will be of the dimensionality d cross n. Now what is happening is here is that the output of the dimensions is scaling with the size of the input. And this is like a fundamentally wrong concept, because if your input is very big, then your output's memory is also increasing. And that makes no sense, because uh, in the brain, like when we are doing processing, we are somehow storing the brain information in the memory, but we are not increasing, we are somehow storing the information in these weights, and we are actually not exploding the amount of memory which is happening. So if you increase the size of the input, even if you increase the size of the input, the memory which is occupied the machine should not increase at all. And unfortunately, this fundamental equation, which is y equal to the wx, is the biggest blunder which we have made in the neural network community, because the memory explodes with the size of the input. And the best, like, even if it explodes linearly, it doesn't make any sense, because in the brain, we our memory is just limited by the number of weights in the connections, okay? And that is like a very minute difference. And this is something which the people who actually appreciate CNN transformers will never tell you. But my conversations with Hinton actually told me about this, and this is why I'm sharing this. Okay, now coming back to like the top down process here. So here, like what I told you, like M1, M2, M3, and you needed to store M1 and M2 in the memory while you are updating M3. So this was like the biggest bottleneck. So since this was like the biggest bottleneck, I don't know how to solve it, but I am looking for how to solving this in my other research work. And there is another problem here. So the problem is that Hinton assumed one other thing. So let's say this is time 1 and this is time 2. So he assumed that while you are at time step 2, you cannot compute this point. So you can't know what will happen in this layer until you have processed M5 and forwarded through the network and calculated this. Okay, so it is not possible to know what's happening at the low or later layer before the input has been fed to it. Now, this is like the biggest problem here, because the point is that let's say you have a neural network of 10 layers. So this is a problem with forward also. So if you have, let's say, these 5 layers, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So when you're piping in the data, this fifth layer will only start receiving the data at t equal to 5 after the data has passed through all these layers. And this is actually a big problem, right? Because if the network is very deep, you can see that the amount of time it takes for the data to reach here is still not like is still dependent on the length of the path, and it is still like a big bottleneck here. Okay, so although he managed to fix like the forward and backward propagation part, this locking, but during a single forward pass also, this bottleneck is still remaining, where like the layer at a later time step is only updated as soon as it receives the later data before it, but that depends on the length of the path. So there is still a great degree of lag going on here, which is not good. Okay, so now what you can imagine is that there is a new type of machine which you could create, and the design of that machine could go something as follows, which I will tell. So let's say that you have 5 layers. What you could have is you have an input, and this input is fed to all the layers together, and as soon as they receive the input, they start updating themselves. So they start updating themselves as soon as they receive the input, and similarly they receive the data through forward during the learning process, and eventually they update that also. So here, like at initial time, all the layers will receive the data, and that would be pretty cool. Okay, because they since they receive the data at a single time, that is a really good option, and that is something which Hinton has not talked about at all. So that is the whole point, and I hope like you understood this analogy of treating a image as a boring video. And now let us look at some other philosophical stuff which Hinton has written. Okay, so now he says that the problem can be reduced by using the contextual predictions from other images to create negative pairs, but the use of negative data rather than negative internal representation seems more robust. It does not require any restrictions, such as only using the past to predict the future. So basically, what it means here is that, do you remember when I told you that there were images of these two classes and he was taking alpha from 1, 1 minus alpha from 1, and using that to form a negative data? Now that is like one way to form the negative data, but there is another way to form the negative data, and that goes as follows. So let us say that you have a neural network which consists of several layers, and you send it a vector v. So you send a vector v as input, and it gives you like some vector v dash as output. So imagine that there is this vector v dash, and you have a bunch of vectors which are parallel, perpendicular to it. So there can be another vector called v1, v2. So there is like this disk which is perpendicular to this v dash, and all the vectors which lie in this disk are the ones which are essentially perpendicular and very much negative to v dash. So what you could do is you could take a v, you can pipe this data, and you can directly feed like a vector which is negative of this back to the network, and that will give you the negative data which you are looking for. So what Hinton is saying here is that relying on negative data rather than using negative internal representation seems much more robust. So he says that he experimented with taking like these orthogonal type of vectors and using them as a source of negative data, but he found that by relying on external sources of data which are actually negative, you could perform better as compared to just this piping mechanism, which is like a really good thing. Okay, and that is like one thing which we need to be really interested about. Okay, and now in the end, like gets like uh he gets like very uh he gets like very philosophical, and let me talk about the stuff where he talks about the connections of forward to Boltzmann machines. Now, Boltzmann machine is a concept which led him to the Nobel Prize, and there are several interesting ideas there which I think are still relevant in practice. And what he's trying to say here is that one connection which he is saying here is something which is related to the sleeping phase. So in a neural network, what happens is that during the day, what happens is that we learn the representations, and during the night, we are actually doing some sort of things. We are dreaming and we are carrying out some learning phenomenon. So what happens is that let's say we have a brain. So during the day, you present it some input X and it learns some representations using some task, whatever we are doing. And during the night, there is another process which is called as dreaming. And what happens in dreaming is that somehow you are like generating your own dreams. So you are sampling from like the top part of the network, and then you are using that to actually drive the learning process again. So there is a mechanism inside the neural network. In the night, what happens is that somehow it is able to choose the starting point. It is able to choose like the starting point, and then it is able to do like some sort of learning on this data, some sort of learning on this data, and that is actually reminiscent of how the dreams work. So what he's saying is that there is a connection between how the dreams work, which he calls as REM sleep, and how the dreaming happens. And the point is that what you can do is like you can build just one machine. What it is doing is during the day, it is performing some sort of discriminative tasks, which is like some sort of tasks like object detection, object perception, or something like that. But during the night, what is happening is that you take this machine offline, and what's happening is that there is some way in which this machine is able to dream. So what happens is that you choose a starting point, and then you're generating like a sequence, and you're doing some sort of learning on this sequence, and that is equivalent to like biological dreaming. And somehow like once you do this sort of unlearning phase or like dreaming phase, it is helping you to improve upon the representations which you learned during the day. And what he's saying is that this way, so he's saying that this negative learning which is happening in the, so this dreaming mechanism which is happening in the brain is somehow similar to the negative phase, to the negative samples, to the negative data which is being piped through the network in normal forward. So he's saying that the negative phase of updates in the network is equivalent to that. Now the key point is that in forward he's relying on an external source of negative data. He's relying on an external source of negative data, and it is not clear that how will you get such source of negative data when you are sleeping. Because the thing is that when you are sleeping, all of your senses are off, like they're essentially off. You are not aware about what is happening, and you're still getting some data from whatever you have learned and still sampling from it, and you are still doing some learning on it. So what happens is it shows us two things: that when we are sleeping, our brain is generative, and somehow we are sampling something and doing some sort of learning, and that is actually helping us. Now, how we are sampling it, what is the nature of what we are sampling, and what is the path, like what is the mechanism of doing that learning, is something which is not clear, not even to like biologists and not even to Hinton. And he has just tried to like red tape it by using this sort of negative weight update mechanism. Okay, and the key point is like all of this is just essentially math, and this is how like a normal Boltzmann machine worked. But that's not important. The important part is the mechanism he's trying to simulate. So the key reference is this Crick and Michelson paper. This key reference is this key Michelson Crick's function of dream sleep paper, and I will cover that in another video to see what is exactly happening and what is the nature of dreams in neural networks. And I believe that this is the connection between decoding consciousness in the networks and trying to understand how to surpass like the Turing test. But again, this is all very hand wavy things. Uh, but that's like what we have to do as scientists. Okay, now this is good. So what he's saying is that the Boltzmann machine had two ideas. One is that you minimize the energy on real data and maximize the free energy on negative data. And this is what like a normal forward algorithm is doing. And the other thing is that you look at use the Hopfield energy as the energy function and use repeated strategies updates to sample global configuration derived from the energy function. And that's what he's saying, that during the dreaming phase you are somehow sampling from like the whatever your model has learned, and then you're using that to derive the learning process. Okay, and that is like what he's saying, and that is the core part which he wants to crack. How do you dream, and what sort of sampling mechanism is happening during the dream? And unfortunately, like a lot of the researchers are not focusing on the dreaming phase. Okay, now here another thing he's saying is that if you look at generative adversarial networks, they had two problems. The first problem was that they split the network into two parts. One was a generator and one was a discriminator. Now, the point is that the generator is a separate set of neurons which is responsible for generating stuff, and discriminator is a separate set of neurons which is responsible for discriminating whether the generated stuff is good or bad. Okay, but this is actually not. And then, since you separate like these two kind of learning neurons, so there is like one module which is generating shit and one which is trying to discriminate between it. This is actually leading to collapse. And what I mean by collapse is basically that they generate like nice images, but they suffer from mode collapse. And there are like there can be large regions of image in space which never generate samples, and that is like the key problem with GANs. Okay, so the key fundamental issue comes appears like in the generative type of networks as soon as you try to separate them between a generating mechanism and a discriminating mechanism. And what Hinton points towards here is that there should be a machine which is possible in which there is just one set of neurons and you're able to generate and discriminate using this same machine. And that is like the dream which he's trying to achieve, and that is something like which he has not been able to do. Okay, uh, okay, so now this thing is good. And now another thing like what he says is that you can use forward to do that. You can use like forward type of learning to build a sort of model in which you first do generation and then you do discrimination together. And actually like I have some work which does that, and let me talk about it later. Okay, Okay, now he goes on to say about a few things which are like the problem in existing modes of contrastive learning, and he's like not happy with what is happening in SimCLR and all the other techniques which he himself has told he which he himself has pioneered, and he believes that there is something fundamentally wrong with the contrastive learning also, which I will go into here. Okay, so here he says that a major weakness of SimCLR like methods is that a lot of computation is used to derive the representation of two image crops, and the objective function only provides a modest amount of constraint on the representations, and this limits the rate at which information about the domain can be injected into the weights. So what he's saying is that if you so all that contrastive learning does is that it takes an image and it generates like two crops I dash and I double dash, and then somehow it tells them to be closer together, right? So so basically to do that, like you have to compute like a forward pass for I dash and I double dash to get those representations, and you just pull them together, right? So you are incurring the cost of two forward passes and you're just then bringing them closer in the representational space. So the amount of learning signal which you are getting by bringing two representations closer, it's not that much. You're just making them a little bit closer, but to make them you need to compute the representations first, and that costs you flops in terms of like the two forward passes which you're consuming through the network. So what Hinton is saying is that uh, when so there are a million possible alternatives, and uh, he is saying that to make the representation of a club be closer to its correct mate than to a million possible alternatives only takes 20 bits of information. Okay, so this is like a problem which is like happening and which he wants to like solve. Okay, now this is fine. And then he points towards a work by Cindy Loe which I have covered earlier. Okay, and I will be honest, like I am not able to understand a lot of this stuff, but hopefully with time, as I keep making these videos, I will be able to find like more of this works. Okay. Okay, now this is like a key point which he comes up within forward, and this is something which he calls as learning fast and slow. And what he says is that basically if you have like a if you have like a five-layered neural network, and you know the amount of goodness which you desire for each layer, okay, then it is possible to update this neural network in a single shot. Okay, so let's imagine that you have an array and you want to store something at location 4, and you will store like a value there. Okay, so you can query the array with location 4, and then in a single shot you are able to store information in that array. Okay, that's a similar behavior like which Hinton wants to achieve in a normal neural network, which is that you have a neural network and you know like the exact goodness which you want at each layer. So what should be like the precise weight update which you need to make at each layer to get that exact goodness? And the weight update should be like single shot. And that is what like Hinton is saying, that when you're feeding in a data, so he's saying that you're only feeding in one sample, and you know the exact amount of goodness each layer should possess. So then there should be like a weight update possible, which allows you to update this whole neural network in a single forward pass, okay, without any learning. So there is no learning here because the network is able to directly converge on the set of weights which it needs to actually store the information of that test sample. And what Hinton has done is that he has derived this. So the amount of weight which you need to change at this each layer is given by this, and then he is actually calculating the value of an optimal learning rate as follows. So the key point is that what Hinton is saying is that there is a class of neural networks possible. There is a class of neural nets possible where what will happen is that you have like, so the key problem is that you are given like certain amount of information X, and you're given like output representation Y, and you want to fit a weight which is able to best satisfy this. He's saying that generally in gradient descent, what you're doing is like you're trying to converge on like the best set of weights which reduces the error on Y, and that is like the best way to get the information, and that requires like several iterations of gradient descent to find the best set of weights which solve a given learning problem. What he's saying is that you don't need gradient descent at all. So you can see that he says that you don't need gradient descent at all, but instead what is possible to do is that assuming that you just have one sample which you're trying to process, and that you know like the amount of goodness which you need to calculate for each layer, it is possible to find the set of weights perfectly which specialize for that sample in a single step. So you can make rapid changes to these weights in a single step to store the information, and that is actually really good because that will allow you to like store the information in a constant time, and there is no more learning involved. So he's saying that if you can actually find a way, if you can actually find a way to get rid of gradient descent, that would be amazing. So that's the core point, which is like find a way to get rid of gradient descent. Now if you are a person who has always done optimization in his life, and you are used to modeling the neural networks as energy and Bayesian networks, this is going to sound wild, right? How can you have a large amount of weight update, and how can you know the perfect point in the space where you can converge for a given amount of X and Y? How do you know like the what is the correct point in the space? And that's why you need a learning algorithm. But Hinton says that you don't need that at all. It is possible to get rid of gradient descent entirely, and that is something which he is trying to go over in this footnote, and that is what like is a really important part. Okay, now before this, now let me like wrap up with a new concept which he titles as model computation. So what he's saying is that there are two types of networks. So let's say you have two devices, three devices, D1, D2, D3, D4. And what you're gonna do is like you have a copy of the same model here, right? So what happens is that these models are immortal. Why are they immortal? Because let's say you have a model running on a particular device D1, and the power of D1 goes away. So you can essentially dump the model's weight, and you can dump its structure to the disk, right? And because you can dump it to the disk, what happens is that you have this model and you have its weights, you dump it to the disk. So when you restart your machine, you can essentially have the same copy of the model restarted. So it will be as if the machine never died, the model never died, even though the machine died. And that is why it is immortal in practice. And this immortality is actually good because it is actually helping the neural networks to share information among themselves very fast. So if you have like four networks which have different set of weights, W1, W2, W3, W4, you can essentially sum up their weights in a weight average and then share the information. So this is a very fast way of exchanging information as compared to, let's say, learning through gradient descent. And that is what he's saying. So there is a way in which like you have a way to make copies of the same model across different devices, and you can still like compress their knowledge and share the weights. And that is what he's saying is that that is what like is immortal. And he's saying that you can get rid of immortal and you can come up with something called model computation, which is like a which is like a different idea. And the idea of model computation is very different. So what will happen is that in the next 20 or 30 years, you will have like a giant brain, you will have a giant embedding which will sit on your device, okay? And you will ask this embedding to do a particular task. So you will say, let's say you want to classify an imaging, you want to classify an image. So this embedding will grow to form a neural network on your device, which will solve the task you care about, and then it will come back. And this giant embedding, it will go back to this giant embedding. So if you have, let's say, a very big GPU, let's say a Hopper, and if you have just a cell phone, so what will happen is that the embedding which sits in both is constant. Okay, there is no change in this embedding. This embedding is constant, and it's so small, it's so compressed representation that it's able to compress the information really well. But the point is that once this embedding starts replicating and it forms like a neural network on a H100, it has like 200 gigs or 150 gigs of resources, so it will form like a larger neural network, and here it will form like a smaller neural network. So obviously, but both of these neural networks will come from a same embedding, okay? And since they come from the same embedding, what will happen is that essentially their ability, like they have the same knowledge, but because they will replicate, so on the machine which is like more which is having more resources, the neural network will replicate more, and on the machine which has low resources, it will replicate less. So the performance you get on the lower end machine is going to be less as compared to performance which you get on the higher end machine. But the reason it's important is the way you are exchanging knowledge, because fundamentally the amount of knowledge which a smaller neural network has and the bigger neural network has in Hinton's way is constant. It does not change. So it does not depend on how many number of parameters you have, because you actually can construct like that amount of knowledge in a single neural network from a compressed space, which can grow to become like a giant network or small network. So now what Hinton does is that he contrasts this with knowledge distillation. So in knowledge distillation, the understanding is that you have a large network and you have a small network, and the small network learns to mimic the logics of the large network. And if your information signal is like and if you have a small network, generally that means lower performance because your student network is not capable enough. But there is a different way to like transfer the knowledge, where you have like networks of different structure, and they have like a common embedding space. And what you can do is they are like DNA. So like DNA, all the information of a human can be encoded in a DNA, no matter how big the human is or whether he's a child. And the point is that since you can encode this information, you can essentially build like a new kind of machine which is similar to DNA. So that's what he's saying. And in the end, what he says is that if you want your trillion parameter neural net to only consume a few watts, model computation may be the only option, and its feasibility rests on learning procedure whose precise details are unknown. So in the thing which I explained to you, so if you have like some small embedding and it has to grow to form a neural network which will do a particular task, then the structure of the neural network is not known beforehand. But this embedding will like replicate and figure out this structure, and then that will allow it to actually learn like a good structure, and that will require a learning algorithm which allows you to train a neural network whose structure is also changing on the fly, and that is what forward algorithm will permit you to do. So this is like what I think the future looks like, and there will be no more knowledge distillation, I think, in the next 5 or 10 years. And you can come back to this video once knowledge distillation is no longer existing in the world. So the hint of that is that he says that the ability to share weights across large models provides a much higher bandwidth way to share knowledge than distillation. So here Hinton is also thinking about a way to get rid of knowledge distillation, and get rid of the technique on which all the companies and the basic pioneers also rely on. So I am really grateful to Geoff Hinton for this paper because it takes a rare amount of intellect and courage to actually get to write a paper which is trying to get rid of the very techniques which he has championed over the decades. But that is how the progress is going to be derived. Now, Hinton ends his paper by saying that there are several ways in which, like, several directions to forward. And he's saying is that how to produce a generative model of images or video that is good enough to create negative data needed for unsupervised learning. So how do you sample like the negative data during the dreaming phase from the network itself rather than rely on external negative data, which he had to. And he's interested in other sort of activation functions, and then he also wants to understand how does it work well in sequential data like videos. Now there is like a key point here which is like very important. So if you look like at his paper in very detail, like you have to actually understand like when he is talking about the negative data. So let me go to there. Okay, so if you see here, he calls the negative data as a temporary crutch. So the key point is that he thinks that the negative data will be sampled from the neural network itself, and that is after like the network has managed to construct like a generative model from which you can sample the negative data. But since he could not figure it out, that is why he had to rely on negative data in forward in the first place. So if you are conducting research on forward and you are trying to figuring out how to get negative data from some external network, then you're doing it all wrong. And all you want to do is figure out a way to sample the negative data from the network itself, and it will rely on making a generative model which works well in practice. And I think is a secret sauce which Hinton is missing right now, and which nobody else knows on how to solve. So yeah, that's it for the forward. And I think at this point, like I'm pretty sure this is gonna be one of the most comprehensive videos on forward out there. uh, and it tries to like deeply understand what Hinton is thinking here. And if you find something which I have missed, please let me know, and I will make like a better video of forward in future again. But I think like I have covered everything in more detail. Thank you.